Here's a short story about a pastor who lost his faith and found his way back to God. The Silent Bell. Daniel stood before the pulpit, his voice trembling with words he no longer believed. For years he had preached with passion, his sermons rippling through the small town like a river of faith. But somewhere along the way, the river had dried up. It started with a whisper, a quiet doubt that grew louder over time. The prayers he lifted up for the sick went unanswered. The struggles of the congregation weighed on his shoulders like a burden too heavy to bear. The suffering in the world became louder than the voice of God, and soon Pastor Daniel felt utterly abandoned by the one he had devoted his life to. Week after week he preached, going through the motions with an empty heart. The church bell that once called the town to worship now felt like a hollow echo in his soul. One evening, after a particularly long day of visiting the sick, Daniel sat alone in the church, staring at the wooden cross that hung above the altar. He had no words left to pray. The silence of the empty church only mirrored the silence he felt from God. His hands trembled as he clenched his Bible, struggling to grasp any sense of divine presence. "Where are you?" he whispered into the dark. The next Sunday, the congregation gathered, expecting their usual sermon. But Daniel couldn't stand behind the pulpit. His faith was gone, and he didn't have the heart to pretend anymore. He stood before the congregation, his hands shaking as he confessed his truth. "I can't lead you anymore," Daniel said, his voice raw. "I've lost my faith." There was a collective gasp in the room, faces filled with shock and confusion. The silence that followed was heavy, each person wrestling with what they'd just heard. Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest, but also an emptiness he hadn't expected. He stepped down from the pulpit, ready to walk away from it all. But as he reached the church door, a voice stopped him. It was old Mrs. Harper, the woman who had sat in the front pew every Sunday for as long as Daniel could remember. Her frail hands grasped her cane as she slowly stood up, her voice quivering with age but firm with conviction. "Pastor, we've all lost faith at some point, but that's not the end." Daniel turned, unsure of what to say, his eyes heavy with tears. "You think you've lost your way, but maybe God isn't done with you yet," she said softly, her words piercing through his heart. "Sometimes the silence means he's working on something deeper." The room was still. The congregation, once filled with disbelief, now gazed at Daniel with understanding and grace. They didn't need him to be perfect. They needed him to be real. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Mrs. Harper's words replayed in his mind. He had lost his way, yes, but was God truly done with him? In the middle of the night, Daniel rose and left his house. He walked to the church, his heart racing with a flicker of hope that had long been extinguished. He opened the church door and stood before the altar, the darkness surrounding him like a thick fog. He fell to his knees, no longer holding back the tears. For the first time in years, he cried out to God, not with polished words or rehearsed prayers, but with the rawness of his brokenness. "God, if you're still there, I need you." In the stillness, Daniel felt something stir within him. It wasn't an overwhelming rush of emotion or a booming voice from heaven, but in the quiet of that empty church, Daniel sensed a presence, a gentle whisper in his soul. "Come back." It was as if the weight that had crushed him for so long was being lifted. The doubts were still there, the questions unanswered, but in that moment, Daniel knew he wasn't alone. He hadn't been abandoned. He rose to his feet, the air in the church feeling different. There was no grand vision, no miraculous sign, but there was peace, a peace that had been missing for so long. The next Sunday, Pastor Daniel stood behind the pulpit once more. He didn't have all the answers. His faith wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was growing again. "I stand before you not as a man who has it all figured out," Daniel began, "but as someone who has walked through the valley of doubt and found that God still walks with me." The congregation listened, not for the eloquence of his words, but for the truth in his heart. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel heard the bell of the church ring, not just in the steeple above, but in his soul. This story reflects the journey of faith as something that is often full of doubts and questions. But in the midst of the silence, God continues to call us back, offering hope and renewal.